Hi everyone, we're going to get started in just a few seconds. Okay, welcome to Politics and Prose Live. We're thrilled this evening to be hosting Frederick Logevall for his new book, JFK, and you can purchase a copy of that book from Politics and Prose through a link that I've just posted in our chat. We really encourage everyone to purchase a copy of the book. It's a great way to support our author and to also support your local independent bookstore. Secondly, I wanted to remind everyone that the latter portion of tonight's event is going to be devoted to your questions, and we highly encourage everyone to ask a question, and you can do so by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. Just can click on that, type in your question, and we will try to get to as many of those as we can. We also have a chat that you can use, but we ask that you keep your questions to the Q&A. It just makes things a little bit easier. And with all that being said, tonight I am honored to introduce Frederick Logevall. He is the Lawrence D. Belfer Professor of International Affairs and a Professor of History at Harvard University. He is a specialist on U.S. foreign relations history and modern international history, and he is the author or editor of 9 books, most recently Embers of War, which won the Pulitzer Prize for History. Tonight he is here to discuss his new book, JFK, Coming of Age in the American Century. The book attempts to capture the real JFK, and it also tells the parallel story of America's mid-century rise. Tonight, Frederick will be in conversation with Diane McWhorter. She is a longtime contributor to the New York Times and the op-ed page of USA Today, among many other national publications. Her first book was the Pulitzer Prize-winning Carry Me Home, Birmingham, Alabama, The Climactic Battle of the Civil Rights Revolution. She is also the author of the young adult history of the Civil Rights Movement, A Dream of Freedom. So please join me in welcoming Frederick and Diane.
Hello, Fred.
Good to see you, Diane.
Okay, so before we get down to the grueling intellectual discussion, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. And I'm assuming that many of our viewers are poised and fun with their very artfully arranged bookcases, just like you. And if their bookcases are anything like mine, they have about, at least a dozen books about JFK or his presidency or one of the Kennedys. So to get the sales pitch out of the way, why Kennedy? Why now? Why Fred Logevall?
I think Diane, I guess I've always been fascinated by Kennedy and by the family. I do think it's really one of the great American stories. What they I guess you could say what they achieved, the tragedies they suffered, what Kennedy himself did. And so part of it was that. I think part of it was also that though we have endless books, as you say, on the Kennedys, and by the way, this entire side of the room is Kennedy books. And so I know as well as anybody that this or that aspect of his life, of his administration, there are books on it. But we actually have surprisingly few biographies. And I have a thought or two on why that is the case. But I also thought there's a need for this, and I'm somebody who can provide it. And then I think maybe third, Diane, I came to the realization that I could offer not just the life of John F. Kennedy, but also the story of America during his half century. And so I had this idea that this could be a biography, but also, since I come at this as a historian, this could be a history. And that in fact, maybe, just maybe, one can understand seminal moments in American history and world history better through the lens of Kennedy, so that it's not only contextualizing his life, but using his life to understand this era. I guess that's why I did this.
It's a wonderful book, I will say. And one of the things I appreciated most about it was the very clear, elegant cliff notes, really, of major historical events, so that, somebody who doesn't want to read a whole book on, the lead up to World War II can really sort of understand the broad strokes reading this. It's just really wonderful. Did the idea grow out of your Pulitzer Prize winning book on Vietnam, Embers of War? Was that part of what?
Yeah, Partly, I mean, I had written about Kennedy before, especially in the Cold War and especially Vietnam, as you say. And coincidentally, I open Embers of War with his trip to Indochina with Robert and Patricia, his siblings, in 1951. At that point, of course, I did not know that the next book would be a biography. So I think so. I think it grew out of that previous scholarship, and I think a sense that the Kennedy Library, just down the street from where I'm speaking tonight, has such a marvelous set of papers. And I thought, though people have been utilizing those papers, somehow they feel underutilized to me, or they have felt for some time. And so I thought, you know what, I can do this, and the materials are there to maybe do this thing justice. And of course, the family, I already knew this, but they were tremendous letter writers, especially during the 30s and through the end of World War II. He had diaries, which I make use of. So yeah, I think it was partly from the previous research and also knowing that the collections were really great.
Well, that brings me to my next question. Did you find anything new, or did you rediscover something known that sort of made the kaleidoscope flip so that you saw it reordered all the little pieces in a different way?
It's so great. I mean, you know exactly what this is like yourself
Yes.
from your own work, but those eureka moments that we have as historians or biographers. Yeah, lots of those. One that comes to mind, I'll just mention, is sitting there at the Kennedy Library, looking at JFK's speeches from 1946. So he's a skinny 29-year-old first-time candidate, and seeing, Diane, themes in these speeches when he ran for the House, that, by the way, speeches that he wrote mostly by himself, that articulate themes that he's going to carry with him through the end of his days. That was one of those moments that, for example, maybe the best example, that iconic phrase from his inaugural address, maybe one of the most famous lines in any inaugural address, at least this century, or in the last century, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That he's actually articulating that basic sentiment already here in 46. And when I saw his warning to Americans, don't be cynical about politics and politicians. This is what democracy demands. He tells his audiences, we get the government we deserve. That was one of those moments that really hit home. I remember seeing those early speeches.
What was the context of that he felt the need to warn people?
I think he already understood in 46 already, so right after the war, that a lot of the people he encountered on the trail, a lot of voters in the Massachusetts 11th district, were in fact down on politicians. He sensed it already then. And it's interesting, even at Harvard as an undergraduate, he had been really interested in the question of what democracy requires. Can democracy survive? Now we're in 36, 37, 38, 39. Can democracy survive the challenge posed by especially the Nazis? So he was interested in the requirements of American democracy and what it needed. And I think when he ran for the House in 46, I think he felt the need to, on some level, educate the audiences that he encountered about this messy thing called democracy.
Well, what I loved about the book too was the way that comes out in the context of his father's appeasement. Yeah. And one of the things so I realized, even though I was just little Miss Smarty Pants about how many books on the Kennedys I read, reading your book, I was kind of shocked at the extent to which I had bought into a lot of the conventional wisdom, about his early pre-presidency, and I was shocked, especially by how influential his father, the ambassador to the court of St. James, was. Everybody knows that he was an appeaser. And I had no idea that he had Neville Chamberlain's ear so much. Or talk a little bit about, I was fascinated by the rationale he had as basically as a businessman for appeasement.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the things that surprised me in my research, was the degree to which, as you say, he was a pretty close associate of Neville Chamberlain, number one. So he's ambassador, I should tell folks, he's ambassador from 38 to 40. So a critical period in the lead up to war. And then he's there for about a year after the war begins for the British. So it's a pivotal moment in this story. And he's close to Chamberlain. He is actually more of an appeaser maybe even than Chamberlain himself, in the sense that even after the British enter the war, after the German invasion of Poland, Joe Kennedy is preaching the need for making a deal with Hitler, for certainly keeping the United States out of the war, heaven forbid. And I think his motivation is, as you say, it's substantially, well, first and foremost, it's about family. I think he's concerned that his two oldest sons, Joe Jr. and Jack, are going to perhaps have to fight this thing, and he wants to prevent that. And then Bobby's not too far behind. And it's also about his tendency throughout his life to personalize all policy issues. And so he's made a fortune. He's become an extremely wealthy man. I think he's concerned that this thing could lose it all for him if this war continues and if the U.S. becomes involved. I think that's what's driving this.
Well, the thing that struck me was that he didn't have the imagination to understand that Hitler had more on his mind. He thought that as soon as, I guess, some of the Versailles Treaty was reversed and that Germany had full economic participation in Europe, that he wouldn't jeopardize that with by starting a war, right? He just didn't have the imagination to understand that people are motivated by more than that.
No,
and then Jack does. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. We should get to Jack, but yes, I just want to underscore your point. It's so good, Diane, that Kennedy, that Ambassador Kennedy, didn't have that imagination. He persisted in believing that it's economics that's driving Hitler's motivation here, as it is for all of us, that Hitler is a conventional statesman who, if we can make concessions to him here, perhaps over Czechoslovakia, perhaps in the Balkans, perhaps elsewhere, then he'll be satisfied. We can make deals with this guy. He persisted in that view to the end. And as you were about to say, which we should discuss, what's fascinating to me is that whereas Joe Jr. can never separate himself from his father, Jack does.
He does, but he kind of finesses it through Why England Slept, which was his honors thesis in college, and talk about how, well, maybe that's not. He's sort of. I was amazed at how, first of all, he uses all his connections to get primary sources, and then he hires an army of stenographers to take it down. And I thought just the sheer management skills of an undergraduate at that point, like pointed him to the presidency. But the argument is what you said earlier about, can democracy deal with these emergencies? And we're facing that now. I mean, I thought it was so relevant because we sort of take democracy for granted that its benefits are manifest, and yet he understood that, what the dangers were.
I think that he did. I was struck by the degree to which the Harvard undergraduate student body, so the student body of which he's a part, was deeply isolationist, was opposed by and large even to aiding the British and the French. So they were much more in line with Joe Kennedy Sr. But Jack, especially in his senior year, 39-40, begins to see, I think partly because of his conversations with his professors, who tend to be more internationalist, more interventionist than were the students. Jack begins to see, wait a minute, maybe isolationism is untenable. Maybe, in fact, we do have to aid the British and the French and possibly even get into the war ourselves. And so I do think that the senior thesis, and I'm not the first, I think, to say this, but it's a kind of declaration of independence. Maybe that's too strong, but it's a mark of his willingness to separate himself from his father, because the thesis, though it's in some ways sympathetic to the plight of Chamberlain and other British leaders, it also recognizes that it's not going to be tenable for the United States, or for that matter for the British, going forward to follow that same policy. And he becomes, I think, long before Pearl Harbor, John F. Kennedy is committed internationalist in a way his father is not and his brother is not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then Joe, I think in early 1945, he was unapologetic about his isolationism and appeasement.
It stays right to the end. It's there actually after the war, because the two of them are starkly opposed on what becomes the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Kennedy is still preaching a kind of a Fortress America kind of approach to world affairs. He argues, and more than a few historians would probably agree with him on this. He argued that Joe Stalin's not going to invade anybody. Stalin understands as well as anybody how weak the Soviet Union is. This Cold War thing that we're embarked upon is unnecessary and it's stupid. Jack is, I argue in the book, one of the original Cold Warriors. Mm-hmm. So there's a much sharper differentiation between father and son once we get into the late 40s.
Right. And then, as you said, Joe Jr. ends up sticking with his dad. And then some people believe that one of the reasons he volunteered for the reckless mission that ultimately killed him was to prove that he wasn't yellow or chicken like his dad was accused of, right?
It's an incredible story. The tragedy of Joe Jr., who was the golden child. He was the one who was supposedly destined for great political success, maybe even the White House. And as you say, he volunteers for a mission that turns out to be completely unnecessary in 1944. Partly, I think, because he wants to match his younger brother's exploits in the South Pacific, PT-109 and that whole story, which made JFK a kind of a heroic figure. But it's also, as you say, because Joe Kennedy Sr. had a reputation for cowardice, because when the London Blitz began, I think it's, by the way, undeserved, that reputation, but there was that suggestion that Joe Kennedy Sr., went out into the countryside so that he could avoid the threat of being bombed. I think, as you say, that's also part of Joe Jr.'s motivation in volunteering for what was a kind of suicide mission. And of course, it killed him.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also the other thing that I hadn't realized until reading your book was the extent to which Jack, we'll call him Jack because that was all he was known as then, Jack had already eclipsed Joe, because I hadn't realized that his friend John Hersey had written the account of the PT-109 heroism, while the war was still going on, right? Joe is already, seeing his destiny slip away, right? Joe Jr.
I think he is, and Jack, again, we'll go with that. Jack had published his senior thesis. It became a kind of minor bestseller, Why England Slept, and Joe had not been able to achieve that. Joe Jr., he tried very hard to become a published author. His father pushed him to become a published author. He told both boys, you know what, having a book will really help you in your career. And so he preached that message to both of them. But there too, the kid brother managed to get there first. And I don't want to maybe overstate the importance of this, but I do think it helped to drive Joe Jr. He wanted to match his younger brother. And I will just say here that in terms of their political prospects, there is this idea, as you know, Diane, that had Joe Jr. returned from the war alive, he would have been the great politician. And for reasons that I lay out in the book, I'm not sure. I think that Jack had a kind of political savvy, a sense of humor. He had elements that I think his brother did not have.
The finesse.
He had the finesse, and I think people who encountered both of them remarked upon that, actually. And moreover, we should say that Joe Jr. had some policy positions that I think would have been problematic. He was, as we said, deeply isolationist, right up to Pearl Harbor.
Organized Harvard students.
Yeah. And he had expressed admiration for Hitler, and that was not just in family letters, that was in letters to other people. Some of that might have come out, it's not certain to me at all that Joe Jr. was the one who would have been the political star.
Well, a lot of that brings us to a lot of the book is set at Harvard, and probably, I don't know, like a lot of people think that if you've made it to Harvard, essentially you've got it made, right? And I remember watching the Ken Burns's documentary on the Roosevelts, and what really sort of knocked me out was learning that until FDR came down with polio, his greatest grief up until then was not getting into the Porcellian Club.
Yeah.
So can you explain what that means and how the Kennedys fit in? If FDR couldn't get in, think about the Kennedys. Even though Joe Sr. did go to Harvard, but that's kind of the source of a lot of his drive.
I think so.
To get back at the WASPs.
I think it was, and I think he, when Joe Sr. was at Harvard, he wanted desperately to get into one of the final clubs. It didn't have to be Porcellian.
Can you explain what those are?
So the final clubs are elite societies at Harvard. They still exist. And in Joe Sr.'s day, I think in Joe Jr.'s day, Jack's day, Bobby's, Ted's, right through the Kennedys, they were set apart. A very small number of students were allowed into these clubs, and Joe Sr. tried, Joe Jr. tried, they did not get in. Jack did. He got into the Spee Club, and I think it was a source of great satisfaction for him. Ironically, at that time, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who was in the class of 38, predicted the demise of the final clubs. He said, because we now have the new House system, and because the Harvard president is pushing hard for a more meritocratic approach at Harvard, we're going to emphasize intellectual pursuits, it probably means the demise of the clubs. And he said later, which I thought was just priceless, Schlesinger said later, decades later, he said, I underestimated the power of snobbery because the clubs remained, and at least through the period we're talking about here, JFK's period, they dominated, I think, the social life of the university, and he was really proud of the fact that the Spee took him.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing is you touched this lightly, but it's all pervasive in the book. Is the theme of Catholicism and the importance of that. It's almost considered un-American to really focus on that, but even today we take pride in not asking Amy Coney Barrett about her religion, but I kind of started realizing that in a way Catholicism is kind of the key to unlocks a lot, partly from what we were just talking about how Catholics weren't allowed in the final clubs typically, but also probably that helps explain why Joe Kennedy ended up supporting FDR, which is why FDR kind of overvalued him because he was one of the rare fat cats, right? Because can you explore that a little bit? That maybe it was because Joe was one of the few Catholics who had made it into this WASP.
I think so. I think if we start there, I think it's fair to say that the two of them, FDR and Joe Kennedy, formed what was for a time a pretty tight partnership. There weren't a lot of Wall Street bigwigs who supported Roosevelt, and so he wanted to get support wherever he could. But as you say, it's also that this is maybe one of the most prominent Catholic businessmen in the country. And he's supporting me, and I can use him. This is FDR's rationale. I can use him to increase my own support in key northern states with significant Catholic populations. So I think that's part of the calculation there. And I think, as you say, at Harvard, for all of the Kennedys, the fact that they were Catholics meant that they were, notwithstanding their wealth, now I'm talking about the sons, hugely wealthy, way more wealthy than many fellow Harvard students, but they were also to an extent outsiders because they were Catholics. And the Spee Club had only recently begun saying internally, we should start thinking about admitting one or two Catholics here. And I think Jack benefited from this. I think ultimately, I suggest in the book, that the Catholicism is really important in understanding him and his family. He wasn't particularly devout, at least as compared to his mother. Bobby was much more devout. His sisters were, but I think his Catholicism was nevertheless important to him. I find it striking, Diane, that even in the White House, JFK got on his knees to pray. If not every night, Jackie would talk about the fact that he did that. Tells me that though he questioned his faith at various points, and I write about this, it was always there, and I think it was important, and it gave the Kennedys a certain, I don't know what to call it, insider, outsider kind of status.
Right. Yeah. Well, and then it created problems, and that's probably the key explanation for why Joe in particular stood by McCarthy for as long as he did. I mean, so it sort of got him FDR, but then it also gets him McCarthy, right?
It sure does. I mean, the McCarthy piece, this is another eureka moment in seeing just how closely connected Joe McCarthy was to the Kennedys. I knew something about this going in, but not nearly as much as I learned in the materials, which is that Joe in particular, Bobby to a lesser extent, and Eunice, maybe Patricia, they're really close to Joe McCarthy. And in fact, Joe Kennedy is devoted to him right to the end, and talks about
had
it
them up
later
to
on.
Hyannisport, and right?
And they attended, several of them, not Jack, but several of them attended McCarthy's wedding. And that's in part, if we focus on JFK, I think his unwillingness, which caused him real problems with liberals in the Democratic Party, his unwillingness to come out in open opposition to McCarthy was in part because of this family dynamic. Though I don't think Jack himself felt particularly close to McCarthy. All those things that Jack prized, senatorial good manners, reasoning from evidence, treating others with respect, and so on. All those things that I think were important to JFK obviously didn't matter at all to McCarthy, but it's partly that family connection, and then partly, as I think you were suggesting or implying, that, Irish Catholics are a very important part of the electorate in Massachusetts, and even more so, I think, then. And Jack Kennedy did not want to alienate them by coming out in opposition to McCarthy, even when the Senate voted to censure McCarthy.
Mm-hmm. And he was conveniently convalescing, right?
He was. But he could have, as I suggest in the book, he could have instructed Ted Sorensen to register his position on, which would have been, I think, I'm certain it would have been in favor of censure. Uh-huh. But even then, he'd prefer to bob and weave.
Right. Let's see, so Rose, your treatment of Rose struck me as being very kind of interestingly compassionate. Was that kind of a literary decision to try to make her more,
No, I think it was my sense when I weighed the evidence that, she's a complicated figure, no question. There's an emotional reserve that is palpable. I talk about the fact that when young Jack is at Choate at prep school, and he's in the infirmary, constantly, and a few times he's really sick, she never pays him a visit, even when he's at his sickest. And yet she took lots of trips overseas, 17, I think, of them in the early 1930s. And so there is that dimension. But I also think that she was, she had 9 children. She had a husband who cheated on her, from day one. It's a very difficult situation. And moreover, I think she had a very important influence on JFK in ways that I think were beneficial. His interest in history, his interest in books, his love of politics, which I think is a totally fascinating part of all this. That's something he gets much more from her than from Joe. And so I think it's dangerous because Joe is such a dominant figure, and because she tends to recede. Even her kids talked about the fact that when Joe was home, she tended to fade kind of into the background. I don't think we should conclude from that she's, less than important in her children's upbringing, including young Jack.
Well, while I was reading it, the book, and just the whole Kennedy story, the word pathetic kept occurring to me, but like not pathetic with a B. And I finally thought, I kind of know what it means. I kind of know what it is when I see it, but like, let me look up the definition. And the definition is sudden change from a beautiful or important to a silly or ordinary one, especially when not intended. And I thought, she was just so pathetic, the way she would respond to these horrible things by, I don't know, like going to mass, or the way she was, one of the biggest tragedies to befall her was that her daughter, Kathleen Kick, married out of the church to an English nobleman. And so the family is up in arms about this. And one of my favorite lines from Jack. My theory was that, and I just want to tell your future readers that Jack's letters are so incredibly, irreverently, perfect pitch of satire that coming from such a young person.
Yeah.
And so can you read so when the family's all upset about Kick marrying into this family that actually has 3 castles, I think, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's on page 371, starting at the bottom of 371. And so
yeah, that's a letter. If we're talking about the one to Lem Billings,
yes.
When he's happy. I can read just this short little portion if you want, but here's what I write. As for Jack, he was happy for his sister and not much impressed with his mother's objections. Your plaintive howl at not being let in on Kathleen's nuptials reached me this morning, he wrote to Lem Billings. You might as well take it in stride, and as Sister Eunice from the depth of her Catholic wrath so truly said, it's a horrible thing, but it will be nice visiting her after the war, and so we might as well face it. And then he writes, this is pretty great. At family dinners at the Cape, when you don't pass Hardington, that's the new groom, when you don't pass Hardington, the muffins will know how you feel. So that gives an insight into this. But you're so right, Diane, about how Rose, I hadn't thought of that word until you just defined it for us. That describes how she responds to these, and they're terrible tragedies that she faces. This one, not, because these 2 young people are in love. Of course, in my view, she should have been thrilled for her daughter, but she was not. And
then they both end up dying. So, oops.
They do.
I guess we should have they should have let them enjoy their happiness, right?
They should have. And I just want to say, because the moment may pass, but just while we're on this subject, the relationship between JFK and Kathleen and Kick, in some ways, they're the closest of the siblings. I think that they had a connection that really none of the others had, or that he certainly didn't have with any of the others, and she didn't have with any of the others. And when she goes down in a plane crash in 1948, that is a real big blow for him.
Yeah. The other so some of his, you made me see the affection in them, but Rose was renowned for her round robin letters, by which I guess she sent it to one sibling, one child, and they send it to another, and it makes the rounds.
That's how it could work, or it depended. And in some instances, there were copies made, and it would be the same letter that would go out, more or less simultaneously
right.
to the kids.
Which is certainly understandable, but Jack's responses to them are so withering, and again, perfect pitch of put downs, but also affectionate, but really making fun of her piety. And anyway, the other one I wanted you to read was the one to the letter he writes to Bobby. To me, this just also summed up his.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So we talked a little bit about this before. This is during the war. So this is, and by the way, the letters that he writes back home to his family, to his former girlfriend, Inga Arvad, with whom he's actually still kind of in love, from the South Pacific, from this war zone. It's a marvelous group of letters. But he sends this one to Robert, who is in his final months, as I recall, at Milton Academy when this is written. He's joined the Navy Reserve. And I'll just read a portion of it. This is JFK to him. "The folks sent me a clipping of you taking the oath. The sight of you up there, just as a boy, was really moving, particularly as a close examination showed that you had my checked London coat on. I'd like to know what the hell I'm doing out here while you go stroking around in my draped coat. But I suppose that's what we are out here for, or so they tell us, so that our sisters and younger brothers will be safe and secure. Frankly, I don't quite see it that way." And then he goes on and on, but it's
Anyway,
great.
Talking about the beautiful use of bathos, right? Oh, I was so moved to see you. And then I looked closer and saw you're wearing my coat, you know?
Yeah.
Anyway, just so there's just one after another like that. I think we're about time to open up for questions. I want to pose something that maybe, because this will also get us into the whole women, his JFK's relationship with women. You mentioned Inga Arvad, who, you know, she because he called her Inga Binga, she became sort of like a synonym for bimbo in a way in later years. And she's really one of the most important influences on him. But, you know, we look back, I think we tend to look at the Kennedys now through almost through a lens of pathology, you know, some of their behavior. And I'm just wondering, you know, by today's standards, certainly the attitude toward women with Joe that he handed down to Jack, and even the sort of amoral, you know, power grabs and stuff. What are you? What's in your head about that? Are you building toward that? Because it doesn't really come across. Everything is very contextualized here, including even the appeasement. You kind of. One great thing about reading good history is that you really put yourself there at the time, and you kind of don't know what you would do yourself.
Yeah, I mean,
what's your view?
That you raise a large point, and I do think as I work on volume 2, which will cover, you know, the last 7 years of his life. The first one is the first 39 years, and now it's going to be a more focused look, obviously, at 57 to his death in 63. I think in thinking about, in researching, in then writing volume 2, I think this is going to be really important. If we focus just for a moment on the womanizing, since you raised it, you know, I think, as I've said in a couple of these talks, you know, I can't have it both ways, Diane. If I'm going to argue that John F. Kennedy was his own man when it came to career choice, when it came to, you know, world views on foreign policy, when it came to actual decisions during his campaigns, when I do think he made his own decisions, and he certainly told his father what he thought and where he was wrong and so forth. If he was his own man on those issues, he certainly could have been his own man also in terms of how to treat women and how to view them. And he didn't. He is his father's son here. I do find the letters between them both, you know, alarming, sad, remarkable, when, you know, Joe is writing both to Joe Jr. and to Jack as though they're pals on some level, talking about women. And they, to some degree, not as much as the father does, but to some degree, they respond in kind. And I think he made very clear to them that he expected them to view women as objects to be conquered. And that wasn't true all the time of JFK. I don't think it was true of Inga Arvad. I don't think it was true in the end of Jackie, even though he cheated on Jackie from, before the wedding and cheated on her afterwards. But I can't have it both ways on this, and this is a problematic part of the story, no question, and will be in volume 2.
Yeah, it's you could do a whole sort of diagram of history through that, especially when you get into the recklessness, like with Judith Exner, Judah Campbell coming up.
Yeah, and then of course you're right. And then the power differential is different, because then he is, the most powerful person in the world. And that also changes, it seems to me, the equation here. When he's a young man, the women are as keen on this as he is, and it's a different kind of dynamic that I deal with in volume 1. But you're right. That's going to be when we get to Exner and others. That's different.
And how much is at stake that he's risking, by doing that, by being this reckless. I think, let me see if we have any questions. I also wanted to, the other thing that we can sort of set aside or fold into your answers was, one of the other things that really struck me was how you did a great job of I was amazed at how uniform the praise of him was contemporaneously, as opposed to, in the hindsight of glory, kind of with hindsight of glory, but because the accounts from his PT 109 crewmates, for example, I was really surprised at his modesty, his unassumingness. Did that surprise you, that he was so genuine?
I think that it did, and I think I was struck as you were by what his crew members said, not just after the fact. It's one thing in an oral history after he's been killed in Dallas, for these people to remember him in a certain way and to romanticize what occurred in the South Pacific. But even what they wrote, perhaps to parents shortly after the rescue, or what they said to superior officers and so forth in the South Pacific, speak to this. I don't think myself, as I say, that, we should praise him for allowing his boat to be rammed. But I do think his actions after the ramming in helping to save the crew, himself and the crew, it's an extraordinary feat on his part over several days. And in a way, no wonder that so many of them had these things to say about him. And I think, like you say, that he was quite modest about it. That he, even in 46, when they decided they should use this in that first campaign, by all accounts, he was kind of reluctant to use it. He came to see that he had too good a story, and that voters in the Massachusetts 11th district would respond to this. And he came to see, maybe you're right. But even then, I think he was kind of reticent about saying too much about it. And I don't think, I have no reason to believe it wasn't sincere.
Yeah, and he didn't use his privilege at the time to as I say, on Seinfeld, gain hand over other people. There's the wonderful anecdote in your book about the ship carpenter chewing him out because he accidentally splashed water on him, and he just chews him out, up and down. And then Kennedy goes, "Excuse me, that was it," or like, "I'm sorry." Yeah. And then the guy finds out that that's the skipper, right? And
that's right. And he didn't know that, nor did he know, I think, at the time, that this is the ambassador's son and so forth. Yeah, I think it's for me at least, it's an appealing part of his personality. It's not that he couldn't, he could be vain, he could be self-absorbed, but there's this other part of him too.
And even when he used those privileges, it was like, as I said earlier, getting his father to send him books from England about, the lead up to the war and stuff. Yeah. Let me see what we this is this is from, well, I won't say the names. After writing this book, have you altered your understanding of how and why Kennedy decided to choose war in Vietnam?
Well,
oh yeah, so like going back,
yeah.
going back to the beginnings.
I don't think so. Obviously, in volume 2, Vietnam is going to be a very important part of the story. And I've written about it in the past. I'm going to be revisiting that chapter. I think I can say now that it's not John F. Kennedy's finest moment by a long shot. What's the paradox is this, and I have to try to resolve this paradox. How is it that this president, because now he's in the White House, let's put him in the White House. So let's say this is 61, 62. This president, who at least since 1951, when he visited during the French Indochina War, at least since then, had deep misgivings about whether any Western power could succeed by military means in Indochina. By the way, misgivings, skepticism that I don't think ever went away. So that's the paradox. How is it that this same JFK expanded US involvement quite substantially during his 1,000 days in the White House? There's some kind of disconnect there. It's at least partly, I think, sad to say, but it's at least partly for perceived domestic political imperatives, that he thought that it was important for him, maybe especially after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, to show that he and his administration would stand up to the communists, that we need to continue to support South Vietnam. And he got deeper and deeper into this thing. And so I don't think I've changed my view on this. Obviously, I think I'll add nuances. I'm sure I'll learn more about this as I get into the story. And of course, there's the question of what he would have done in Vietnam had he lived, the great counterfactual.
Right. That's the
I'll also address. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think the conventional thing is that he needed after Bay of Pigs, he needed someplace where he could beat communism. Okay, our next question. This is a wonderful session. I'll say that. That's what the questioner says. Thank you. If you could ask the late President Kennedy any 3 questions, personal or political, that nag you, that you struggle with, or maybe just stuff real mysteries that you would like to solve, what would those questions be? And why would you want to know? Why would you seek an answer for them?
I suppose the obvious one is the subject we've just discussed. If I could ask him a question, it would be, what were your intentions on Vietnam when you left for Texas on that fateful final trip? What were you intending to do? I mean, there are some scholars who suggest he had already not only decided that he was going to withdraw from Vietnam, they even suggest he had initiated that withdrawal. This is not an argument that I personally buy, but what was he intending to do? And it's possible he would have said, well, I've got to get through the 64 election. I got to get reelected. And then I'm going to find some kind of political solution here, because I do think Kennedy always drew the line at ground troops. But that's one I would have wanted to ask him. I think I would have wanted to ask him to continue on the foreign policy theme, what he envisioned in terms of the future of Soviet-American relations. It's clear that he and Khrushchev, after the missile crisis, took steps toward a kind of rapprochement, a lessening of Cold War tensions. Did Kennedy, did he want to pursue that? And maybe the third question I would pursue, because this is an election season in 2020, I would want to ask him more about his views on American democracy, what he thinks the secret of America's success, of the American government were, what he felt was necessary. Did he envision an opportunity to be able to work with Republicans and conservative Democrats for something, Diane, for civil rights? What did he think about the prospects there? What did he think about some important domestic questions generally? I guess, I could pick others, but those would be 3 questions.
Okay, now great. Now this one actually feeds into a question I didn't get to, because the other kind of surprising backdrop of the book even though you kind of know about it, was how sickly he was.
Yeah.
And especially when you read about the incredible PT-109 marathon of rescuing, his men, you just wonder how he did it. So the question is, was Jack Kennedy read The Last Rite several times? How did that affect his outlook on life and on his presidency?
Yeah, 3 times total, including, of course, at the time of his death, which tells you something. Even to have this, more than once is something. And there were other times when he was close, when they probably could have summoned the priest because he was that close. And so, yeah, it's a remarkable part of this story that he was as sickly as he was, and that in fact, at a few particular moments, he was really at death's door, and I think that was bound to shape him. I suggest, I think, in the preface, that the combination of his own ailments and the family tragedies, losing Joe Jr., losing Kick, effectively losing Rosemary to a botched lobotomy in late 1941.
Yeah, we haven't talked about that. Yeah.
I think they did make him empathetic in a way. I think he could understand. Maybe one can draw a bit of a parallel between FDR and the polio. I think you referred to it earlier. I think they gave Kennedy a sense of an ability to put himself in other people's shoes that he might not have had otherwise. I would also say one other thing about the health ailments. Important as they were, I find it amazing, Diane, that this is a guy whose energy was, by all accounts, unbelievable. And this is a Kennedy family energy. Others in the family, I think, had the same thing. But he could go on the campaign trail, notwithstanding his pains. He could go from dawn until midnight, day after day after day. And in fact, a secret of his success as a politician is that he worked harder than anybody else. He started earlier, he worked harder. So somehow, even with this frailty, he was able to do a great deal, and maybe on some level it made him work even harder, that he wanted to overcome these frailties and show everybody what he could do.
So question, do you trace that history of sickliness back to the case of scarlet fever he had when he was like, what, 1.5 or something?
Yeah, he was that age. Yeah, I'm not trained to draw too many conclusions from those early years or what they meant, but it's certainly true. I think this is all I say in the book, that it began when he's a toddler. He looked perfectly healthy, was perfectly healthy, I think, at birth, but not long thereafter, this began. How much of an effect, if this is what you're asking, the scarlet fever had on his physique and on his subsequent problems, I don't know.
And you suggest that the Addison's disease may have been caused by the steroids he was taking for his back, or exacerbated?
Yeah, at least contributed to them. I think at least I tried to do some digging into the current medical knowledge about this, and maybe there are things that I missed, but the best that I could see was that it may have contributed to the diagnosis, which didn't happen until 47, although I'm quite confident that he had Addison's well before that. But the sense I got was that these treatments could have contributed to that.
Mm-hmm. There's a very poignant part of the book where he's about to undergo this back surgery that he may have a 50-50 chance of even coming out of, let alone it being successful. And then, the family has had this, as you mentioned, this botched lobotomy with Rosemary, the mentally challenged older sister. And that was the other just chilling thing, the bathos too of them, Joe doing it. We don't think Rose was really aware of the extent of the damage, right? And then Joe writing letters to the kids saying, "Oh, Rosemary's swimming every day when she's basically a vegetable," right?
No, he wrote, and those letters you can anybody can access them at the Kennedy Library. Remarkable. I mentioned, to go back to Rose for a minute, that in these round robin letters that you mentioned earlier, so many of them, 1942, 43, 44, no mention at all of Rosemary. No mention whatsoever. I mean, she's not in those letters, and that's a remarkable thing. And this is the sister who was closest to him. She was third in the order, so she's only about a year and a half younger than Jack. And yes, he's effectively lost her as well.
Yeah. Oh God, it's just terrible. That's just terrible. Okay, let's see. You kind of touched on this. Could you please talk about Kennedy in Vietnam? One sometimes hears that Kennedy, had he lived, he had a second time, and it would have been limited involvement. And then he says, the impression I get from some Kennedy interviews I've watched is that he was very much into the domino theory, and you talk about that. And
I mean, I showed my students his interview with Walter Cronkite on September 2nd, 1963. It was when, I believe it's when CBS went to a 30-minute newscast. So this was a big deal. And Kennedy says, this is just a few months before his death, that in effect he believes in the domino theory. He talks about if South Vietnam goes, these other countries are going to go as well. There's also, as we said, the escalation under on his watch. There's the fact that his administration approves a coup that overthrows the South Vietnamese leader Diem.
Yeah.
Diem is then killed. Lots of things would point to the notion that Kennedy, if he returns from Dallas alive, would have done more or less what Johnson did. I still believe, for reasons I lay out in a recent essay, which appears in the companion volume to Ken Burns and Lynn Novick's film. Jeff Ward produced a book, as he always does, and this one has some essays. I have an essay in there on this question, and I conclude in that essay that though we can never know, the best argument in my view is that a surviving Kennedy would not have Americanized the war in the way that Johnson did, because he always drew the line at ground troops. The key decisions would have come for him in his second and final term, when he no longer has to worry about re-election. I think he uses his advisors better than Johnson does. Several reasons that I lay out. I think he would have opted for some kind of fig leaf political solution, if I were to guess.
Okay, let's see. Okay, I'm gonna combine two here. Would you say that Kennedy's willingness and ability to think for himself, independently of his father, that is, and independently of his generals during the Cuban Missile Crisis, is his most important quality? And let me do this one, because this was like didn't think so much could be learned about JFK. When can we expect volume 2?
Well, the second one I'll just answer quickly. I'm dependent in part on the archives reopening. So why don't we all get together and see if we can get them to allow at least some researchers into the research rooms, the reading rooms, because I'm of course desperate to get back in there. I think it's 2 or 3 years away at minimum. I've done a fair amount of research, but there's more research to do, and of course to write what's going to be a long book. I think on the first question, certainly among his most important qualities is that he was willing to think for himself. He was actually really well informed on the issues. This is something that people in the White House often commented on, that the president seems to know more about even obscure pieces of domestic legislation than others in the room who are the supposed experts on this. And so he prided himself on that, had enough self-confidence, I think, to reject what both military officials on foreign policy issues and other officials told him. And I think that is something one sees early on, as the questioner suggests, and you see it right through to the end. That's one of the things I'm going to be interested in exploring for volume 2, is to what extent can I draw that thread. I should say, by the way, he made mistakes as president. There were missteps. We haven't had a chance to talk, and I don't think we'll have a chance to talk now about civil rights. I would love, Diane, to hear your take on that.
Let's do that quickly. Could you elaborate on Kennedy and race, and maybe combine this with what's the biggest misperception of the early life of JFK?
I think on race, It surprised me actually that his voting record in the House and in the Senate is actually quite progressive. I would have thought, I think before I started the research, that this is a guy who sort of steers clear of this. So in fact, until 56, when he seeks the vice presidential nomination and believes that he's got a tack to the center so that he can appeal to Southerners in the party and get on the ticket that way, I think he's actually, certainly by his votes, he's quite progressive. And I talk about that in the book. What I don't think he felt, probably until 62 or even 63, I don't think he felt what African Americans experienced on a daily basis. I don't think that resonated with him. The discrimination that they saw day after day, I don't think it animated him until pretty late. And then I do think he shifts. But that happens fairly late in the game. He's late, no question, in coming to this issue. I think he's ultimately important for civil rights. And in terms of the legislation that is then passed under LBJ. I think you had a second question in there.
The biggest biggest misperceptions about him, and then a quick one. Oh, this is from David Marlin, who is an alumnus of the Kennedy Justice Department. He's on this Zoom, and he wants to know if you're looking at Burke Marshall's files at the Kennedy Library. Burke Marshall was the Civil Rights Division chief. That David Marlin reported to.
There are so many important collections that I need to get into deeply for this part of the story and Marshall's papers. I just can't wait to get into some of this stuff. I'll just say here briefly before I tackle that last question that the materials at the Kennedy Library, one of the jewels in our presidential library system, they're just so good on so many issues, this one included. I think that maybe the biggest misperception for me, I thought going into this, Diane, that this is a guy who was kind of a callow playboy who didn't really get serious about anything other than, meeting girls and women and having a good time until maybe he's in the House, maybe not even until he's in the Senate, or maybe when he marries Jackie, he decides, okay, I better get serious. I think what surprised me is how early, maybe in his sophomore year at Harvard, junior year at Harvard, he's already beginning to ask serious questions. And that, I think, surprised me. He says in one of his papers, we get the government that we deserve, and democracy is only as good as the leaders that it produces. This is a guy who thinks about these things from an early point, and I think that maybe was the biggest misconception.
Yeah, I had that kind of shift too in my thinking from that. This might be a good one to end on if we're out of time. It's how much cooperation have you gotten from the Kennedy family, and what have some of their initial reactions have been?
I decided early on, rightly or wrongly, that I wouldn't actually pursue interviews with members of the family. Maybe as a consequence, maybe that was a mistake. There's always this idea we have, as you know, Diane, as historians and biographers, that, in the basement is a whole stash of documents that the family will give you access to. And, maybe I forfeited some opportunities there, but I decided not to. I didn't want to give any sense that this was in some ways perhaps authorized or have that impression. And the secondhand information I've gotten has been favorable. Not very much as of this point. The person who I know best is a nephew, Stephen Kennedy Smith. He's been very helpful to me on various points pertaining to the book. He, by the way, along with Doug Brinkley, came out with a collected book, which I recommend, which is Kennedy's speeches, some of his speeches, along with essays by various people commenting on those speeches. And there's one I'll just mention as we finish, because you and I, before we came on the air, talked about, and you, to some extent, we talked about in the session, JFK's sense of humor. The marvelous essay in that collection from Conan O'Brien, in which O'Brien talks about, he thinks that we've had exactly two truly funny presidents. and that's Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy. And he then talks about, he gives examples of Kennedy's humor, which, by the way, I think is a secret of his political success, is that he had that, and we talked about that earlier. But Stephen Kennedy Smith is the person in the family with whom I've had the most interaction. Have met Caroline briefly on a couple of occasions, but it's Stephen most of all.
Well, let's see. I think are our handlers available to tell us if we need to?
I see
Hi.
Tom, and there he is.
There's
Hey.
Tom.
This was an incredible discussion. I think we all got a lot out of it and learned a lot. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks for
having
writing
us.
it, Fred. Just really wonderful. I can't
Well,
recommend it more highly
It's
enough.
great to see you too, Diane, and
Okay.
to meet you, Tom.
Yeah, and again, if anyone is interested in purchasing a copy, there's a link in the chat that takes you to politicsandprose.com. And as always, stay well and stay well read.